adopted the EU sanctions, and of course we take this completely seriously, and we are simply doing everything that can be done in order to enforce them seriously.
That was Switzerland's President Alain Berset speaking in Berlin today about his country's commitment to sanctioning the Kremlin over the war in Ukraine. But is Switzerland really doing all it can to implement sanctions on Russia? And what are other Western countries doing to prevent Russia from trading with the West? Well, according to a report in the Financial Times, some Swiss companies are using a loophole in Switzerland's sanctions legislation to circumvent restrictions and are continuing to trade in millions of dollars of Russian gold and oil. The authors of the report say a provision in Swiss law allows its companies' overseas subsidiaries to trade Russian commodities as long as they are legally independent, a term the Swiss Sanctions Enforcement Agency declined to define. And about all of this, we can speak now to Anastassia Fedyk. She is an assistant professor of finance at Haas School of Business at the University of California in Berkeley. And she's also a founding member of the pressure group Economists for Ukraine. Ms. Fedyk, good to see you again. I want to get on to Switzerland in a second, but Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal was detained shortly after the paper ran a piece precisely saying that Western sanctions were biting. How worried is Russia about these sanctions?
They are worried. And to see that, we just need to look at what they're doing rather than what they're saying. So as an example, the Russian government actually entry banned every single non-Ukrainian American member of our International Working Group on Sanctions, right alongside prominent people like Jill Biden. So that's a clear signal that they're perceiving our sanctions recommendations as extremely negative for the Russian government. So for sure, they are worried about sanctions.
Mm-hmm. Now, zooming in on Switzerland, they say they are doing everything they can to seriously implement sanctions against Russia. Are they?
That's a great question. And I mean, in reality, sanctions are not perfect. They're not perfect in Switzerland. They're unfortunately not perfect in other places as well. But in Switzerland in particular, there is this tension because historically they've had an entrenched belief that a lot of the success of their industry, especially their financial industry, sort of relies on privacy, on kind of hiding account ownership, on these kind of ask no questions and type of approaches. And that's just kind of not the case anymore in the modern interconnected, right, largely global economy. It's a lot more about cooperation, a lot less about sort of hiding and that kind of privacy. And I think Switzerland is moving in the right direction on that front. But the question is whether that's too slow.
Mm-hmm. The G7 and EU ambassadors signed a letter recently calling for Switzerland to close loopholes that would allow companies there to circumvent sanctions on Russia. Now, is that completely without hypocrisy? Are sanctions being implemented to the fullest extent in the G7 nations and in EU member states?
I mean, the short answer is no. It's technically not fully without hypocrisy. Of course, there's scope for better implementation, for better tracking everywhere. But I think the important thing is that the hypocrisy angle, in a way, is irrelevant. It doesn't change what is right and wrong, and it shouldn't be preventing individual members from calling each other out to do better. So I think there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in the way that sanctions have been implemented across different countries. Different countries are leading or lagging in different domains, right? So, for example, individual kind of Russian oligarchs who are sanctioned by the EU is not exactly the same set as who are sanctioned by the US, or the state sponsor of terrorism designation has been implemented in the EU, where it's less biting, not yet in the US, where it's more biting. And so one of the main recommendations from our sanctions group of economists for 2023 is to bring those things more in sync. And of course, that should be done by adopting the maximal kind of union set of sanctions. So for example, if an individual is sanctioned in either US or EU, they should be sanctioned by both. And to do so, I think leaders in each area who are kind of at the forefront should be able to apply pressure and to call out laggards without getting bogged down in these kind of whataboutisms and hypocrisy issues.
All right, fair enough. Now, you talked about Switzerland's business model there being based on this principle of privacy and no questions asked. But Switzerland also has been proudly leaning on its status as a neutral country for a very long time, right? I want to ask you if a country can really call itself neutral if its passivity is benefiting the aggressor.
Yeah, of course, there are limits to neutrality, right? As I guess an example, refusing to prosecute a murderer would not be called neutrality. That would be called a failure to do justice. And so the same can be said for kind of continuing to do business with Russia or refusing to apply appropriate levers and punishments to maximally stop Russia's ongoing aggression in Ukraine. So for sure, the term neutrality has those limits when we start running into clear violations.
Mm-hmm. Let's look at some of the specifics of the sanctions that are in place against Russia, because the price caps on Russian oil introduced by some countries haven't really cut the price of Russian oil as much as was hoped. Does that have to do with the mechanism itself or with Russia limiting production?
Yeah, so there are a few things in place. I would say there's the mechanism, then there is kind of the specifics of the mechanism, and then there's implementation. So I think the mechanism is kind of the success, right? That's what we worked out. That's what took several months for the allied countries to really kind of put in place. And so having that framework is already a really large step forward, because now we can tighten the specifics in that framework. So that's the next step. We definitely, the economists in the sanctions group do recommend lowering the price cap. Now that we have a mechanism in place, we can now start applying that pressure. The other thing, of course, is the implementation, and we are seeing some evidence of issues there in terms of what price Russia's actually selling oil to versus what is being reported. So I think for sure the second lever that should be a big focus for 2023 is going to be to prevent this kind of side transfers that are violating the price cap.
Mm-hmm. How can that be done?
So I think kind of quite similar to what we're talking about with Switzerland, with applying more pressure on our allies to kind of do their job in terms of frameworks for tracking, and then putting a lot of the kind of tracking, reporting, transparency requirements on private entities. So kind of know your customer type of regulations, where individual firms should be responsible for tracking what is happening with their products, including products that they're insuring in the case of oil or transporting, as well as kind of affirmatively attesting that they're not in violation, where any breach of such affirmative attestation would then carry the appropriate penalties in terms of kind of fines, right, for the corporate entities.
Yeah. And now that you mention pressure, the G7 has warned repeatedly that any country helping Russia's war effort, looking over at China mostly, would face severe costs, but they never really explain what the consequences would be. How effective can these kinds of threats be if they're formulated in such a vague way?
Yeah, and I think the reason for that is similar to the reason that we took several months to design our price cap mechanism, right? There's a large diplomatic aspect to it, where we need to work out what is feasible, what is going to work, what we have buy-in from, a larger set of third parties. So that's why they're vague for now, but that doesn't mean that they're not being worked out on kind of more specific basis. And certainly kind of in terms of issuing specific guidance, the sanctions group does recommend being upfront once we have anything specific in mind about this will happen, to kind of deter rather than have to actually go through and punish ex post, which is not in anybody's interest.
Anastassia Fedyk from the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. Always great speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you.